On the morning of November 17, 1992, air traffic controllers at New York's John F. Kennedy International Airport cleared Delta Flight 1503 for landing on runway 22 right. The Boeing 727 touched down at 7:43 local time, taxied to Gate 14 at Terminal 3, and discharged 138 passengers without incident. The crew completed their post-flight procedures, filed their reports, and went home. None of this would have attracted any attention except for one problem. According to every system designed to track aircraft movements in United States airspace, Delta Flight 1503 had never taken off. 3 days before the landing, on November 14th, Delta Flight 1503 departed Orlando International Airport at 6:15 in the evening, bound for LaGuardia Airport in New York. The flight was routine. Captain Robert Hastings had logged over 14,000 hours. First Officer Linda Chen had 3,200. Flight engineer Marcus Webb had been with Delta for 11 years. The aircraft, a Boeing 727-232 with registration number November 723 Delta Alpha, had accumulated 41,000 flight hours since entering service in 1979. Its maintenance record was clean. The weather along the eastern seaboard was clear. Visibility was 10 miles. Winds were light and variable. Delta 1503 checked in with Jacksonville Center at 6:28. The controller assigned them flight level 280 and confirmed their routing through waypoint Cameron, then direct to LaGuardia. First Officer Chen acknowledged. The transponder return showed the aircraft climbing normally through 17,000 feet. Ground speed was 290 knots. Everything was as expected. At 6:31, Jacksonville Center handed off Delta 1503 to the next sector. The controller transmitted the new frequency. First Officer Chen read it back correctly. The radar track continued northeast, steady and predictable. Then, at 6:32 and 14 seconds, the transponder return disappeared from Jacksonville Center's radar scope. The controller waited. Sometimes a transponder drops offline temporarily due to equipment cycling or interference. He waited 15 seconds, then keyed his microphone. Delta 1503, Jacksonville Center, how do you hear? No response. He tried again. Delta 1503, Jacksonville, radio check. Silence. The controller checked his frequency selector, confirmed he was transmitting on the correct channel, and tried a third time. Still nothing. He picked up the landline to the next sector and asked if they had acquired Delta 1503. They had not. He called the previous sector. They confirmed the aircraft had checked in normally and been handed off without issue. The controller returned to his scope. The radar was functioning normally. Other aircraft in the area were painting clearly, but the return for November 723 Delta Alpha was gone. At 6:35, Jacksonville Center declared a communications emergency and initiated standard search procedures. They contacted all adjacent sectors. No one had radio contact with Delta 1503. No one had a radar return. The controller reviewed the last known position. The aircraft had been 38 miles northeast of Jacksonville, tracking 045 degrees, climbing through 22,000 feet. He marked the position and began coordinating with search and rescue. Within 12 minutes, the Coast Guard had dispatched 2 helicopters to the last known coordinates. The Air Force diverted a KC-135 tanker that had been conducting training operations off the coast. The FAA issued an alert notice. Delta Airlines activated their emergency response team. The company immediately began contacting families, but they were instructed to provide minimal information until more was known. At that point, no one was certain what had happened. The aircraft had simply stopped transmitting and vanished from radar. The search area was calculated using the last known position, heading, airspeed, and probable fuel endurance. If the aircraft had continued on its original track, it would have traveled approximately 400 miles before exhausting its fuel. If it had turned, the search area expanded exponentially. The Coast Guard established a grid pattern and began flying search legs at 500 feet. They were looking for debris, oil slicks, or emergency locator transmitter signals. They found nothing. By 9 o'clock that evening, 6 aircraft and 2 Coast Guard cutters were searching a zone covering 12,000 square miles of open water. The weather remained clear. Visibility was excellent. Conditions were ideal for spotting wreckage. But as the hours passed, the search teams reported no contacts, no signals, and no visual sightings of any kind. It was as if the Boeing 727 had evaporated in mid-flight. At Delta's operations center in Atlanta, company officials were reviewing everything they had. The aircraft's dispatch paperwork showed a normal fuel load. The weight and balance figures were within limits. The crew had filed a standard flight plan. There had been no reported mechanical issues, no maintenance write-ups from the previous flight, and no crew concerns logged during pre-flight. Captain Hastings had called in at 5:53 from the gate to report boarding was complete, and they were ready to push back on time. That was the last communication Delta received from the crew. The FAA pulled the voice recordings from Jacksonville Center. The tapes confirmed that First Officer Chen's final transmission had been calm and routine. There was no indication of distress, no request for priority handling, no mention of any abnormality. The radar data was reviewed frame by frame. The transponder return had been steady and normal until the moment it disappeared. There was no gradual fade, no erratic movement, and no altitude deviation. The aircraft had been flying a perfect track, and then it was gone. The National Transportation Safety Board dispatched a GO team to Jacksonville. They set up a command post and began interviewing every controller who had handled Delta 1503. The investigators reviewed maintenance records, weather data, and air traffic logs. They examined the possibility of a mid-air collision, but no other aircraft had been in the vicinity. They considered the possibility of a catastrophic structural failure, but the crew had given no indication of trouble. They looked at the possibility of a sudden decompression or fire, but again, there had been no distress call. Every scenario they considered ran into the same problem. The crew had not communicated any emergency. On the morning of November 15th, the search was expanded. Additional Coast Guard and Navy assets were brought in. Satellite imagery was reviewed. Commercial shipping traffic in the area was contacted and asked to report anything unusual. Nothing was found. The ocean surface showed no sign of debris. No emergency locator transmitter signals were detected. The only evidence that Delta Flight 1503 had ever existed was the radar data showing its departure from Orlando and its final position northeast of Jacksonville. By November 16th, the search had been underway for nearly 48 hours. The NTSB was beginning to consider the possibility that the aircraft had gone down in deep water and sunk quickly, leaving no surface wreckage. But even that scenario had problems. The Boeing 727's fuselage is large and contains significant buoyant structure. Seat cushions, insulation, luggage, and other materials would typically float, yet nothing had been recovered. The search area was increased to 15,000 square miles. Still nothing. Then, on the morning of November 17th, at 7:38 local time, John F. Kennedy International Airport's tower controller received a routine call. Kennedy Tower, Delta 1503, 10 miles south, inbound with information Yankee. The controller glanced at his radar display. There was an aircraft squawking the expected transponder code, 10 miles south of the field, exactly where it should be on the approach. He keyed his microphone. Delta 1503, Kennedy Tower, runway 22 right, cleared to land, wind 230 at 8. First Officer Chen acknowledged. Cleared to land 22 right, Delta 1503. The controller watched the target track inbound. Everything appeared normal. The aircraft descended through 1,000 feet, crossed the threshold, and touched down at 7:43. It rolled out, exited the runway at taxiway Kilo, and was directed to Terminal 3 Gate 14. The controller made a note in his log and moved on to the next arrival. It was only later, when the shift supervisor was reviewing the morning's traffic, that someone noticed the discrepancy. Delta Flight 1503 was listed as having landed at Kennedy, but it was not listed as having departed Orlando that morning. The supervisor checked the flight number. It was correct. He checked the aircraft registration. November 723 Delta Alpha. That was the same aircraft that had been missing for 3 days. He picked up the phone and called Delta Operations. Within 20 minutes, FAA officials were on the phone with the tower supervisor. They asked for a confirmation of the tail number. The supervisor checked the gate assignment. November 723 Delta Alpha was parked at Gate 14. The passengers had deplaned. The crew had exited the aircraft and were in the crew lounge. The FAA officials asked if anyone had spoken to the crew. The supervisor said not yet. The officials requested that the crew be detained and that no one speak to them until investigators arrived. 2 NTSB investigators reached JFK at 9:51. They met with the crew in a private conference room. Captain Hastings, First Officer Chen, and Flight Engineer Webb were confused about why they were being questioned. They said they had flown a normal flight from Orlando to New York and were preparing to deadhead back to Atlanta. The investigators asked them to describe the flight in detail. Captain Hastings said they had departed Orlando at 6:15 the previous evening. They had been cleared to LaGuardia initially, but during the flight, air traffic control had rerouted them to Kennedy due to weather. The crew had complied and landed without incident. The investigators asked what time they had landed. Hastings checked his logbook. 7:43 local time, he said. That morning. The investigators asked him to repeat that. Hastings confirmed. They had departed Orlando the previous evening and landed at Kennedy that morning. Total flight time was 13 hours and 28 minutes. The investigators asked if he understood what he was saying. A flight from Orlando to New York typically takes 2.5 hours. Hastings nodded. He said he was aware of that, but that's not what the flight instruments had shown. First Officer Chen pulled out her navigation log. She had recorded every waypoint, every time check, and every position report. According to her log, they had flown a normal route, but the elapsed time between waypoints had been far longer than expected. Flight Engineer Webb described the fuel burn. He said that when they had landed, the fuel quantity gauges had shown exactly what he would expect after a 2.5-hour flight. But the cockpit clock, which had been synchronized with Orlando Tower before departure, showed that 13.5 hours had elapsed. All 3 crew members confirmed this. They had noticed the discrepancy during the flight, but had assumed there was an instrumentation error. Captain Hastings said he had considered declaring an emergency, but all the aircraft systems were functioning normally, so he had decided to continue. The investigators asked if they had experienced any unusual turbulence, any electrical anomalies, or any navigation system failures. The crew said no. Everything had been smooth. They had maintained radio contact with air traffic control throughout the flight. They had received multiple handoffs between sectors and had landed as directed. The only abnormality, they insisted, was the time. The investigators asked for the crew's personal watches. All 3 wore standard digital wristwatches. Hastings' watch showed the correct local time, synchronized with the JFK Tower clock. Chen's watch showed the same. Webb's watch also matched. But all 3 crew members insisted that their watches had shown the correct time when they departed Orlando the previous evening. They could not explain how their watches now matched the tower clock after a flight they believed had taken 13 hours. The FAA impounded the aircraft. Technicians removed the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder. The flight data recorder is a device that continuously logs aircraft parameters, altitude, airspeed, heading, engine performance, control inputs, and timestamps. The cockpit voice recorder captures all audio in the cockpit, including radio transmissions, crew conversations, and ambient sounds. Both devices are designed to survive catastrophic accidents and provide investigators with an objective record of what occurred. The recorders were sent to the NTSB laboratory in Washington. Analysts began the process of downloading and reviewing the data. The cockpit voice recorder contained approximately 30 minutes of audio, which is standard for the model installed in that aircraft. The recording began at approximately 7:13 that morning and ended at 7:43 when the aircraft came to a stop at the gate. The audio showed a completely normal approach and landing. The crew's communications were routine. There was no discussion of any anomaly, no mention of the time discrepancy, and no indication of distress. The flight data recorder presented a more complex picture. The device records timestamps using an internal clock that increments independently of any external time source. According to the recorder's internal clock, the flight had lasted 2 hours and 31 minutes. The data showed a normal departure from Orlando, a normal climb, cruise, descent, and landing. Every parameter was within normal limits. Fuel flow matched what would be expected for a 2.5-hour flight. Engine temperatures were normal. Altitude and airspeed were consistent with a standard flight profile, but the timestamps did not align with the crew's account. The investigators cross-referenced the flight data recorder's timestamps with air traffic control radar data. According to the radar, Delta 1503 had disappeared from Jacksonville Center's scope at 6:32 on November 14th. The aircraft had not reappeared on any radar system until 7:31 on the morning of November 17th, when it checked in with Kennedy Approach. The gap was 61 hours. The investigators reviewed the cockpit voice recorder again. They listened for any indication that the crew was aware of the time discrepancy. At one point during the approach, First Officer Chen mentioned that the flight had taken longer than expected. Captain Hastings agreed, but attributed it to headwinds. Flight Engineer Webb commented that the fuel burn didn't match the elapsed time, but the conversation moved on. There was no further discussion of the issue. The FAA interviewed the controllers who had handled Delta 1503's arrival at Kennedy. The approach controller said the aircraft had checked in on frequency at 7:31, inbound from the south. The controller said he had cleared them for the visual approach and handed them off to the tower. Everything had been routine. The investigator asked if the controller had been surprised to see Delta 1503, given that it had been missing for 3 days. The controller said he had not been aware of that. He had simply handled the arrival as he would any other inbound flight. The tower controller gave a similar account. He said the aircraft had called 10 miles out, and he had cleared it to land. He had not known about the missing aircraft report until after the landing. When asked if there had been anything unusual about the arrival, the controller said no. The aircraft had flown a normal approach and landed on speed and on centerline. The investigators requested copies of all radar data from the eastern seaboard for the period between November 14th and November 17th. They wanted to see if there was any possibility that the aircraft had been flying during those 3 days, but had somehow not been detected. The FAA provided the data. Analysts reviewed every radar return, every transponder code, and every track file. There was no indication that November 723 Delta Alpha had been airborne at any point between 6:32 on November 14th and 7:31 on November 17th. The fuel analysis provided another contradiction. When the aircraft landed at Kennedy, technicians measured the fuel remaining in the tanks. The total was consistent with a 2.5-hour flight from Orlando. The Boeing 727's fuel consumption is well documented. At typical cruise settings, the aircraft burns approximately 250 gallons per hour per engine, Over a 13-hour flight, the aircraft would have consumed approximately 9,750 gallons of fuel, but the fuel load at landing indicated that only about 1,900 gallons had been used. The numbers did not support the crew's account of a 13-hour flight. The investigators interviewed the passengers. 138 people had been on board Delta Flight 1503. Each was contacted and asked to describe their experience. The responses were consistent. Nearly all of the passengers said the flight had seemed normal. A few mentioned that it had felt longer than expected, but most attributed this to boredom or fatigue. None of the passengers reported anything unusual. No turbulence, no strange sounds, no announcements from the crew about any problem. Several passengers were asked to provide their travel itineraries and receipts. The investigators wanted to establish a timeline. One passenger, a businessman named Gerald Mitchell, had flown from Atlanta to Orlando on the morning of November 14th, attended meetings that afternoon, and boarded Delta 1503 that evening. He said he had checked his watch when the plane landed at Kennedy, and it had shown the correct time. He had taken a taxi to his hotel and checked in. His hotel receipt showed a check-in time of 8:37 on the morning of November 17th. He had not noticed anything unusual. Another passenger, a woman named Sandra Cole, had been traveling with her 2 children. She said the flight had seemed to take a long time, and her children had become restless. But she had assumed it was just the usual difficulty of traveling with young kids. When she arrived at Kennedy, she had called her husband to pick her up. Her phone records showed the call had been made at 8:04 on the morning of November 17th. She had not been aware that 3 days had passed since boarding the flight in Orlando. The investigators asked the passengers if they had eaten during the flight. Delta 1503 was a short-haul flight and meal service was not provided. Snacks and beverages were available, but the flight was expected to last only a few hours. Several passengers said they had purchased snacks, but no one reported being hungry enough to suggest they had been without food for 13 hours. The flight attendants had not distributed additional snacks or made any announcements about an extended flight. The 3 flight attendants were interviewed separately. All 3 gave consistent accounts. They said the flight had been routine. They had completed their pre-flight safety checks, served beverages during cruise, and prepared the cabin for landing. None of them had noticed the time discrepancy. When asked how they had tracked the time, one flight attendant said she had checked her watch periodically but had not paid close attention. Another said she had noticed the flight seemed longer than usual, but had assumed they were flying a slower route. The investigators asked if any passengers had complained about the length of the flight. The attendants said no. A few passengers had asked when they would be landing, but that was normal. No one had expressed concern or alarm. The attendants confirmed that they had not made any announcements about a delay or an extended flight time. From their perspective, everything had been normal. The NTSB expanded the investigation. They contacted the manufacturer, Boeing, and asked if there was any known issue with the 727's timekeeping systems that could account for the discrepancy. Boeing reviewed the aircraft's maintenance records and confirmed that all systems had been functioning normally. The cockpit clock was a standard mechanical unit synchronized with an external time source before each flight. There was no mechanism by which the clock could lose or gain 13 hours without the crew noticing. The investigators also considered the possibility of a navigational error. Could the aircraft have somehow flown a much longer route, circled for hours without the crew realizing it, and still landed with fuel consistent with a short flight? The flight data recorder ruled this out. The recorder showed a direct route from Orlando to New York with no deviations. The total distance flown matched the expected flight path. There was no evidence of extended holding patterns, circuitous routing, or fuel dumping. A meteorologist was brought in to review weather data for November 14th through November 17th. The investigator wanted to know if there had been any unusual atmospheric conditions that could have affected the aircraft's instruments or the crew's perception of time. The meteorologist reviewed satellite data, weather station reports, and pilot reports from other aircraft in the area. There had been no unusual weather, no solar storms, no significant turbulence, and no reported anomalies of any kind. The FAA conducted a review of all air traffic control communications for the relevant time period. They wanted to see if Delta 1503 had been in contact with any facility during the missing 61 hours. The review covered every air traffic control center from Florida to New York. Thousands of hours of audio were analyzed. Delta 1503 did not appear on any frequency until 7:31 on the morning of November 17th, when First Officer Chen checked in with Kennedy Approach. In early December, the NTSB convened a technical review panel. The panel included representatives from the FAA, Delta Airlines, Boeing, the Airline Pilots Association, and independent aviation experts. The panel reviewed all the evidence and attempted to construct a coherent explanation. Every theory was examined. Mechanical failure was ruled out because the aircraft had landed normally and the flight data recorder showed no anomalies. Pilot error was ruled out because the crew had followed all procedures correctly. Navigation error was ruled out because the flight path was documented and correct. The panel considered the possibility that the flight data recorder had malfunctioned and that the crew's account was accurate. But this theory required believing that the recorder had failed in a way that made a 13-hour flight appear to be 2.5 hours, while simultaneously recording accurate data for all other parameters. It also required believing that the fuel burn, which is a physical process independent of any recorder, had somehow matched a short flight despite the aircraft flying for 13 hours. The panel found this scenario implausible. The panel then considered the possibility that the crew and passengers had experienced some form of time distortion. Perhaps the clocks in the cockpit had malfunctioned, or the crew's perception of time had been altered by an unknown factor. But this theory also had problems. The crew's watches had synchronized with the tower clock after landing. The passengers' phones and personal devices all showed the correct time. If the crew had experienced a localized time anomaly, it should have persisted after landing. It did not. The most troubling aspect of the incident was the radar data. Delta 1503 had disappeared from Jacksonville Center's scope at 6:32 on November 14th. For the next 61 hours, it had not appeared on any radar system, despite the fact that the eastern seaboard is one of the most heavily monitored airspaces in the world. Then, at 7:31 on November 17th, it had reappeared exactly where it should have been on a normal flight from Orlando to New York. The aircraft had resumed its flight as if no time had passed. One panel member suggested that the aircraft had been flying below radar coverage during the missing period, but this was quickly dismissed. The Boeing 727 cannot fly for 61 hours on the fuel it was carrying. It also cannot fly low enough to avoid radar for that duration without the crew noticing and reporting it. The theory required too many impossible conditions to be credible. Another panel member raised the possibility of a deliberate act. Could the crew have intentionally disabled the transponder and flown to an unknown location, landed, refueled, and then resumed the flight to New York? The investigators examined this theory closely. They reviewed the crew's backgrounds, financial records, and personal lives. There was no evidence of criminal intent, no motive, and no indication that the crew had done anything improper. The theory was also inconsistent with the fuel data. The aircraft had landed with fuel consistent with a direct flight from Orlando to New York. There was no evidence of an intermediate stop. The panel discussed the possibility that the incident was related to a classified military operation. Perhaps the aircraft had been intercepted, diverted, and then released with the crew's memory altered or suppressed. But this theory required a level of technological capability that did not exist, at least not in any publicly known form. It also required the cooperation of 138 passengers, none of whom reported anything unusual. The panel found no evidence to support this scenario. By late December, the NTSB had exhausted all conventional explanations. The final report, released in February 1993, concluded that Delta Flight 1503 had departed Orlando on November 14th and landed at JFK on November 17th. The report documented the radar data, the crew testimony, the flight data recorder analysis, and the fuel calculations. It noted the discrepancies and the lack of a coherent explanation. The probable cause section of the report was left blank. The NTSB could not determine what had happened. Delta Airlines quietly retired the aircraft 6 months later. November 723 Delta Alpha was flown to a storage facility in Arizona and eventually scrapped. The crew returned to duty after a brief leave. Captain Hastings flew for Delta until his retirement in 2001. First Officer Chen transferred to another airline and continued flying. Flight Engineer Webb left aviation entirely and took a job in manufacturing. None of them spoke publicly about the incident. The passengers moved on with their lives. Most were unaware that anything unusual had occurred. Those who were contacted by investigators were asked to keep the details confidential. The FAA issued an internal memo instructing controllers to report any similar incidents immediately, but no guidance was provided on how to handle such reports. Over the years, a few researchers and aviation enthusiasts have attempted to investigate the incident. Most have focused on the radar data, looking for gaps or errors that might explain the disappearance. None have found anything conclusive. The radar data has been reviewed multiple times, and it consistently shows the same thing. Delta 1503 vanished at 6:32 on November 14th and reappeared at 7:31 on November 17th. There is no intermediate track. In 2003, a former FAA official gave an interview in which he mentioned the Delta 1503 incident. He described it as one of the most perplexing cases he had encountered in his career. He said that the agency had conducted a thorough review and had found no explanation. When asked what he thought had happened, he said he didn't know. He added that the incident had never been satisfactorily resolved and that it remained an open question within certain circles of the FAA. A few years later, a retired NTSB investigator published a book on unsolved aviation incidents. He included a chapter on Delta Flight 1503. In the chapter, he reviewed the evidence and discussed the various theories that had been considered. He concluded by noting that the incident defied conventional analysis. He wrote that the flight data recorder, the fuel burn, and the passenger testimony all indicated a normal 2.5-hour flight. But the radar data and the timeline indicated that 61 hours had elapsed. He could not reconcile these facts. The investigator also mentioned something that had not been widely reported. During the review of the cockpit voice recorder, analysts had noticed a brief audio artifact approximately 47 minutes into the recording. The artifact lasted less than 2 seconds and consisted of a low-frequency tone that did not correspond to any known aircraft sound. The analysts had initially dismissed it as electrical noise or a recording anomaly. But when they examined the flight data recorder for the same time period, they found a corresponding gap. The gap was exactly 1.9 seconds long. During that gap, no data was recorded. All parameters flatlined, then resumed exactly where they should have been if no gap had occurred. The investigator wrote that the gap had been noted in the official report, but had not been emphasized because it did not seem significant. The flight data recorder had functioned normally before and after the gap. The aircraft had continued flying without any indication of a problem. The gap was treated as a minor technical glitch. But in hindsight, the investigator wondered if the gap was connected to the larger mystery. He had no evidence to support this, only a suspicion that the gap might have been the moment when something changed. In 2011, the FAA released a set of previously classified documents related to radar anomalies. Among the documents was a report from Jacksonville Center dated November 15, 1992. The report described the disappearance of Delta 1503 and noted that the radar return had vanished without warning. The report also mentioned that at the exact moment the aircraft disappeared, 3 other radar targets in different sectors had simultaneously dropped off for approximately 2 seconds before returning. The report stated that this was highly unusual and recommended further investigation. There is no indication that such an investigation was conducted. The 3 other aircraft that experienced the brief radar dropout were a commercial flight en route to Miami, a private aircraft flying along the coast, and a military transport. All 3 aircraft landed normally and reported no anomalies. The pilots were not interviewed, and no connection was made to Delta 1503 at the time. The radar dropout was attributed to a technical issue and filed away. One aviation researcher, after reviewing the documents, noted that the 3 other aircraft had been approximately equidistant from Jacksonville Center at the moment of the dropout. They formed a rough circle with a radius of about 250 miles, centered somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Georgia. Delta 1503 had been near the edge of that circle. The researcher suggested that whatever caused the radar dropout might have affected a specific geographic area rather than a single aircraft, but without more data, this remains speculation. Another detail emerged in 2014 when a former Delta mechanic came forward. He said that when November 723 Delta Alpha had been inspected after the incident, technicians had found something unusual. The aircraft's altimeter, which measures altitude using barometric pressure, had a small amount of corrosion on the internal mechanism. The corrosion was unusual because the altimeter had been overhauled only 3 months prior. The mechanic said that the corrosion pattern suggested the instrument had been exposed to salt air for an extended period, far longer than a typical flight. But the corrosion was on the inside of the sealed instrument, which should have been impossible. The mechanic's report was never included in the NTSB investigation because the altimeter was not considered relevant to the incident. In recent years, the incident has been mentioned occasionally in aviation forums and podcasts. Most discussions focus on the impossibility of reconciling the conflicting data. Some have suggested that the entire incident was a bureaucratic error, that the radar data was mislabeled or the timelines were confused. But the FAA's records are detailed and cross-referenced. The radar data has been verified multiple times. The timeline is consistent across multiple independent sources. If it was an error, it was an extraordinarily complex and persistent one. What remains is a set of facts that do not fit together. An aircraft departed Orlando on the evening of November 14th. It disappeared from radar 37 minutes later. It reappeared 61 hours later, exactly where it should have been on a normal flight, and landed as scheduled. The crew and passengers experienced a flight that felt longer than normal, but showed all the physical characteristics of a short flight. The flight data recorder showed 2.5 hours. The fuel burn confirmed 2.5 hours, but the elapsed time was 61 hours. No one has been able to explain where the aircraft was during the missing time. It did not land anywhere. It did not appear on any radar. It did not communicate with any facility. It simply was not there. And then it was. The crew insisted their clocks showed 13 hours had passed, but their fuel and the recorder showed otherwise. The passengers noticed nothing. The aircraft itself gave no indication that anything had changed. The official conclusion, such as it is that Delta Flight 1503 departed Orlando and landed at JFK. The discrepancies in the timeline remain unexplained. The NTSB report offers no probable cause and no recommendations. The case is closed but not resolved. In 2019, Captain Hastings gave his only recorded interview about the incident. He was 81 years old and living in Florida. He was asked what he remembered most clearly about the flight. He said it was the moment they checked in with Kennedy approach. He said that when the controller acknowledged their call, he had felt a sense of relief, as if they had been gone longer than they realized and were finally returning. He could not explain the feeling. He said that for years afterward, he would sometimes wake up at night, thinking about the flight. He said he knew the numbers didn't make sense, but he also knew what he had experienced. He said he had learned to live with the contradiction. When asked if he thought anyone would ever figure out what happened, Hastings paused. He said he didn't think so. He said that some things happen in aviation that defy explanation, and this was one of them. He said the best anyone could do was document the facts and leave it for others to consider. He passed away in 2022. The aircraft, the crew, and most of the passengers are gone now. What remains is the data. Radar tracks that show an aircraft vanishing and reappearing. Cockpit recordings that document a routine flight. A flight data recorder that logs 2.5 hours. Fuel receipts that confirm a short flight. And a timeline that insists 61 hours passed. All of it verified. All of it contradictory. All of it real. If you follow aviation mysteries and unexplained incidents, subscribe for future investigations.